This is a download from the BBC.
If you're partial to bagels and chicken soup, or if you're a bit of a schmoozer and you think you've got chutzpah, then you've already been captivated by Yiddish language and culture. Until last century, Yiddish was widely spoken by European Jews from Russia in the east to the Netherlands in the west. But it's a culture that goes far deeper than its popular portrayal.
If I were a rich man, all day long if I were a wealthy man.
The famous song from the musical Fiddler on the Roof, the story of a Jewish peasant living in Imperial Russia. But that only gives a small insight into the great masterpiece of Yiddish literature it's actually based on. At its height, Yiddish had a great tradition of writers and thinkers. Einstein's theory of relativity was even translated into Yiddish twice in the 1920s, and it was spoken by more than 10 million people. This vast number of speakers was severely depleted after the Holocaust. But what is it that makes this endangered culture so valuable, and what does its future hold? Hello and welcome to The Forum. Joining me to find out more about Yiddish from Massachusetts in the United States is the founder and director of the Yiddish Book Center, Aaron Lansky, who's helped to save more than 1 million Yiddish books from destruction. And in the studio, the Russian Jewish composer and performer Polina Skovoroda Shepherd, who's also the director of 2 Yiddish choirs in the UK. And Dr Lily Kahn from the Hebrew and Jewish Studies Department at University College London, and author of Colloquial Yiddish. Welcome to you all. Let me begin by asking you all about your own connections with Yiddish. Aaron, your family were Yiddish speakers before they came to the United States, just before World War I. But how aware were they of their heritage?
Well, my grandparents continued to speak the language among themselves, but never with us grandchildren. My mother spoke nothing but Yiddish till she was 6 years old and went off to public school. But we were American kids, and I think they didn't want to burden us with the freight of history and the weight of history, and therefore Yiddish was not generally spoken. Where
would they come from specifically in Europe?
On my mother's side, they came from the area that was called Galicia, which was actually then where they were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and on my father's side from the Ukraine and Bialystok.
And I understand your grandmother actually threw away a lot of her stuff from that part of the world.
Well, she didn't quite throw it away. She came to America when she was 16 years old. She said goodbye to her parents, never saw them again. And she boarded a boat, came all alone at 16 to the United States. She arrived at Ellis Island. She had an older brother who had come to the States before her. He met her, and he took her in a ferry boat across to Manhattan. And along the way, he saw she was holding on to this cardboard suitcase packed with all of her most precious belongings. There was a pair of Shabbos Sabbath candlesticks. There were the books that she had chosen to take, and there were photographs of her family. And her brother took it, and he flung the suitcase overboard and said to her, "You're in America now. You have to learn to leave the old country behind." I was 35 years old before anybody even told me that story because they thought it was such a shunda. It was so disgraceful in their eyes that the world should know about this. But on the other hand, I think it was far more emblematic of the immigrant experience than they could possibly have known. You know, all immigrant groups become uprooted. The difference for Jews, of course, was that the old country was eventually destroyed for them. And therefore, those who survived, those who continue that culture were the ones who had left in large measure. And they had to carry the culture with them and reinvent it and reinvigorate it for themselves.
So fortunately now your work, Aaron, is to do with rescuing and preserving Yiddish culture with your book centre rather than throwing away memories, and we'll talk more about that later. Polina, tell me, when did you first properly come across Yiddish?
I never thought about being Jewish or having any connection with Yiddish at all until I was 16 years old. I was a Soviet citizen.
And you were asking for a passport, and that's
yes,
how you found out?
Age 16 I had to get my first Russian passport, and at that time we had to put an ethnic background line on our first page. So I had an option of putting Russian or Jewish. And my parents convinced me to write Russian because apparently with Russian you would have less trouble. So I was mentioned as Russian in my passport.
But you became aware then.
But I became aware and I started asking questions.
And Lily, tell me, what has drawn you to Yiddish?
Like Aaron, I come from a Yiddish-speaking family background, so my grandparents and great-grandparents on both sides spoke Yiddish. my grandfather on my mother's side, who I was closest to, was from Odessa, and he had actually grown up speaking Russian, but he learned Yiddish when he came to New York because it was so, widely spoken at the time when he arrived. And I really got into it myself through being interested in endangered languages and minority languages, because I spoke Hebrew before I started studying Yiddish. And it was when I was in university that I wanted to study other Jewish languages, and that was the one that was kind of from my family background. And so I started learning it, and then I just fell in love with it and continued.
Well, Aaron, we've mentioned that Yiddish was the language of the European Jews, but what kind of a language is it exactly? Because some refer to it, wrongly, I believe, as a corrupted form of German.
In fact, Jews themselves used to refer to the language as jargon. However, it was Max Weinreich, the great Yiddish cultural historian, who once said that a language is a dialect with an army. Yiddish certainly never had the army, but it was definitely a language. In fact, it was spoken for a longer period of time in more places by more Jews than any other language in Jewish history. There are 18 Jewish languages in all, but Yiddish was by far the longest spoken and the most ubiquitous of them.
And Aaron, let's just go back to the actual origins. When did people first start speaking Yiddish? And then tell me why as well.
Yiddish really emerged about 1,000 years ago. I mean, there's plenty of controversy around this, but probably around 1,000 years ago in the Rhineland. And developed in the way that most Jewish languages had developed, that Jews were a sufficiently insular population that they picked up the languages of the indigenous population, but then made a kind of Jewish version of that. So all Jewish languages are written in a Hebrew alphabet. They all incorporate words from Hebrew and Aramaic, but they have a kind of Jewish take on the mainstream culture.
And Aramaic is?
Aramaic was also a much older language, a language that Jesus spoke, in fact.
Lily, many Jews from Western Europe ended up emigrating to Eastern Europe. So did this lead to different variants of Yiddish?
So there are two main varieties of Yiddish, what's called Western Yiddish and Eastern Yiddish. And Western Yiddish, as you can imagine, is the form of Yiddish that was spoken in the Netherlands, France, Germany, and Switzerland by Jews who never moved out of those regions. And then in the medieval period, you get large migrations of Jews into Central and Eastern Europe, into the Slavic-speaking regions, with kind of particularly large Jewish populations emerging in Poland and Lithuania and Ukraine.
And why was that?
There were kind of various reasons. There were expulsions and the Crusades in Western Europe. The Crusades played a big part in it. And Poland was also very welcoming to the Jews. So a lot of Jews settled in the Kingdom of Poland because they were given better rights there. So usually when people talk about Yiddish nowadays, they're actually referring to Eastern Yiddish, which has its own dialects. But Eastern Yiddish is the Yiddish that really became the main variety. And Western Yiddish more or less died out around the beginning of the 19th century.
And Aaron, would you say that the Yiddish language reflects the experience of the people who are actually speaking it?
Yeah, I would say that all languages reflect the experience of the people who speak them. And in the case of Yiddish, it was such a distinctive culture that the language is therefore imbued with that distinctive sensibility. It has a kind of inherent marginality rooted in a very long tradition of languages and literature.
Can you give me some examples? Proverbs, for example.
Many proverbs in Yiddish actually are very interesting because they tend to begin in Hebrew and end in Yiddish, which itself suggests kind of an internal tension in the Jewish world. So you would say, Ato b'chatono mikol ha'amihim, thou hast chosen us from amongst the nations, which is a Hebrew locution, and then quickly turns to Yiddish and says, To was hast du gewollt von dein Volk Yisrael, so how come you had to pick on us Jews? So there are many juxtapositions like that give the language its oomph, I would say.
Well, to get more of a sense of what life was like for Yiddish-speaking people, let's hear a song from you, Polina. This is a folk song, I understand.
Yes,
just tell me about what it's about and what the roots are.
It's about leaving your parents. It's about saying goodbye to where you live and moving, we don't know where, whether it's a young lady who is getting married and leaving her shtetl, or whether it's a recruit that's being taken to the Tsarist army. As we know, these people served in the army for 25 years, so that's saying goodbye to your everything for kind of the entire life, as you can think. And it could be also something like Aaron's grandmother leaving Russia or leaving Ukraine and moving to America. So this is saying goodbye and moving to somewhere where winds don't blow, where there is no sunshine, and where birds don't fly. Oh, seid Gesundheit, meine liebe Eltern, ich fahre weg in a weiten Weg, wo keine Wind weht nicht und wo kein Vögel fliegt nicht und wo kein Hahn kräht nicht, wo keine Wind weht nicht und wo kein Vögel fliegt nicht und wo kein Hahn kräht nicht.
Wow, is what I can say to that. So soulful, it's full of yearning and longing, and beautifully sung, by the way, as well.
Thank you.
I mean, without knowing what it means, you can feel the magic of that. I mean, could you say that this is the kind of Yiddish version of the blues, almost?
Oh, I don't know the blues that well, but I think, I guess so. Yeah. It's speaking from the soul, primarily.
Definitely very, very soulful, and we'll hear some more. By the 18th century, it was the Hasidic movement that became a dominant force in European Jewish life. Now, Lily, just briefly, can you explain what this was?
So the Hasidic movement is a spiritual movement that emerged at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century in Eastern Europe, that was kind of seen as quite radical at the time because the sort of traditional model of Jewish life was sort of all centered around the yeshiva, which is a traditional Jewish academy where the main focus of study was, and still is to this day, the Talmud, which is a huge compendium of Jewish law. And the Hasidic movement grew out of this idea that you could have a much more spontaneous and mystical relationship with the divine than was traditionally emphasized. So there was a sort of an emphasis on going out and praying in the forest and communing with nature. And there was, kind of a lot of emphasis on music, and it was also very charismatic. So this movement grew to be a very widespread and popular movement among the Jews of Eastern Europe, and all Yiddish speaking.
So we know that the Hasidic movement was popular. It was very unorthodox, very accessible, and used song and dance to reach intense spiritual states. And I know, that, Polina, this Hasidic genre of singing is something that's unique to Yiddish culture and of particular interest to you. Tell me more about that.
I probably should say something about the nigunim, which is a fantastic way into this culture for somebody who, for example, me, who didn't know Hebrew or Yiddish.
And nigunim means songs or tunes?
Nigun is a melody, tunes without any words at all. So, and they take you to the divine without having to study Torah, without knowing Hebrew. So I love these things. So maybe I should just sing one of them.
Go ahead.
Ya da 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 ya da 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 ya da 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 ya da 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 ya da 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 ya da 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 ya da ya da 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 ya da 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 ya da ya da 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 ya da 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 ya da da ya da 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 ya da da ya da ya da 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 ya da 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 ya ya da 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 ya da 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 ya da 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 ya da 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 ai da da.
That was incredible, and I kind of recognise that a little bit. Again, the plaintive tone of it, but also the fact that there's no actual words, as you say. And this was central to Hasidic worship, was it?
The whole point is that you don't really have text, which is, first of all, you need to know texts, and if you don't know them, it kind of holds you back. And secondly, it's abstract. So you go into this spiritual, mystical place by repeating and repeating these nigunim, and there is this idea of heightening your consciousness and coming back in a slightly more enlightened state.
Well, alongside the religious Hasidic movement, and partly as a reaction to it, Yiddish culture was also developing on a secular, more intellectual level with the Jewish Enlightenment, or Haskalah. Originally, the intention was to develop Jewish literature and thinking using the Hebrew language, but somehow Yiddish ended up being chosen. Now, tell me why that was, Aaron.
Well, it wasn't so much chosen as it chose itself. The Enlightenment movement, originally, the intellectuals turned to Hebrew, which, of course, was the classical Jewish language, and tried to write in that to spread new ideas and spread ideas of reason among the masses. The problem was the masses couldn't exactly read that, or at least not very well. And because no one had spoken the language for 2,000 years, it had a kind of stilted quality to it at that point. So some intellectuals, by the mid-19th century especially, began sort of reluctantly to turn to Yiddish to spread Enlightenment ideas. And what does McLuhan say? The medium is the message. The more they wrote in the language, the more they became attuned to its artistic possibilities. And suddenly Yiddish literature came bursting forth. And so by the late 19th century, it swept across all of Eastern Europe.
Well, one of the giants of modern Yiddish literature who first wrote in Hebrew but then achieved great success in Yiddish was a writer known as Sholem Aleichem. His most famous works centre on the character of Tevye, the dairyman, which later inspired the musical Fiddler on the Roof, as we heard. Lily, would you read a short extract from the very opening story about Tevye?
This is the beginning of the collection of Sholem Aleichem's very famous stories about Tevye. It's called Das große Gewinns, which is translated in different ways. I think Tevye strikes it rich, or like the big win, and it starts off like this. Als is beschert das große Gewinns, hört ihr, Pani Sholem Aleichem, kommt das gleich in Stube rein. Wie sagt ihr? La menetzeach alagitis, als geht, läuft es.
Thanks, Lily. And here is an English translation of that.
If you're meant to strike it rich, you may as well stay home with your slippers on, because good luck will find you there too. The more it blows, the better it goes, as King David says in his Psalms. And believe me, neither brains nor brawns has anything to do with it. And vice versa. If it's not in the cards, you can run back and forth till you're blue in the face. It'll do you as much good as last winter's snow.
Now, the translation was by Hillel Halkin. But, Aaron, just give me an idea of how important this book is in the canon of Yiddish literature.
Well, it's important enough that it's my very favorite Yiddish book of all time, and possibly my favorite book, period. It's extraordinary. It's given rise to translations into many, many languages. Of course, it gave rise to Fiddler on the Roof. But unfortunately, something like Fiddler on the Roof is sort of almost the opposite of the original stories in many ways. It tells the same stories, the same arc to it. But in Fiddler on the Roof, it really takes Tevye and it transplants him. It locates him in a shtetl, in a small town of, probably several thousand people, where there are many Jews and a rabbi to whom he can turn for authority. Whereas in the original Tevye stories, Tevye is what they call a Dorfsjid, a village Jew. He lives out in the middle of nowhere. There are absolutely no Jews around apart from his own family. And as each of his daughters brings in a new man into the family, each of whom presents the family with a new challenge of modernity, there's nobody to whom Tevye can turn for help except to his own resources. He has to figure it out for himself. And of course, the reason that's so important is because in that sense, Tevye becomes a precursor for all of us, for Jews today who are many of whom are much less constrained by their communities. It's much more incumbent upon them to figure out how in the world do we live as Jews in a modern world. So we're kind of all in the same boat as Tevye had found himself.
And in fact, as an illustration of how it can be understood and appreciated by anybody from any culture, I understand that the stories of Tevye have been a bestseller in Japan. Is that right?
So I hear. And I think for obvious reasons. My teacher Ruth Weiss once said that what made Tevye unique in its time was at a moment when people like Turgenev were writing fathers and sons viewed from the point of view of the children. Tevye takes intergenerational conflict, inevitable generational conflict, and views it from the point of view of the father or of the parents instead. And I think somehow that resonated in Japan also.
And Turgenev is a Russian writer, we should emphasize here as well. Now, in 1908, Yiddish was proclaimed a national language of the Jewish people. But, Lily, has Yiddish ever been an official language of any actual state?
Not really. I guess the closest exception to that is Birobidzhan, which was an autonomous region, or is still an autonomous region in Russia. So it was founded in the 1920s as an official Jewish autonomous region in the Soviet Union, and it was officially Yiddish-speaking and still is. And then Yiddish had official status for a few years in Ukraine, and I think it was 1918 to 1921. And now Yiddish has official minority status in some European countries like Sweden. It's never had official status in the same way that, say, Hebrew has official status in Israel or French has official status in France. So it's always been a minority language.
But that early part of the 20th century, you could say was its peak in terms of its usage. And sadly, that wasn't to last. Aaron, just give me an overview now of the factors that led to the demise of Yiddish around the mid-20th century.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you the bad news and then I'll tell you the good news. How's that? So the bad news was, of course, the Holocaust simply wiped out much of the Yiddish-speaking population of Europe. There were 11 million Yiddish-speaking Jews in the world, more or less, in 1939, and by 1945, half of them had been murdered in the Holocaust. So obviously, no culture could have recovered readily from depredations of that magnitude. As though that weren't enough, many Yiddish writers fled into the Soviet Union or were already living in the Soviet Union, where increasing persecution finally culminated on the night of August 12th, 1952, when Stalin ordered the execution of many of his country's major Yiddish writers on a single night. And then, of course, we went to Israel. But the premise of Israel was to create something new. It was going to be a new Jewish identity rooted in our own land again. And as a result, Yiddish was pushed away. Hebrew was adopted instead. In fact, even the pronunciation of Hebrew was kind of de-Yiddishized along the way. And it's only recently that I think Israel's come to terms with Yiddish a little more than it had. But when I said, though, that it's a little more complicated, there's been an extraordinary resurgence of interest in Yiddish among many different kinds of people around the world. And I should also add that the Hasidic movement, although it begins in the 18th century and picks up steam in the 19th century, has not really gone away. When I was a kid growing up in Massachusetts, I barely had heard of Hasidic Jews. I barely knew about it. Today, however, it's far more prominent. The New York Times ran a story not long ago in which they said that 70% of all Jewish children in New York City today are either Hasidic or ultra-Orthodox. And the reason, of course, that's so significant is a demographic one, because the average birth rate in the Hasidic world is about 9 kids per family. And you don't have to spend too much time doing the arithmetic before you figure out that that is a very quickly growing population. So as a result, the number of Yiddish speakers is actually on the rise today, which is a bit counterintuitive for many of us.
This is the Forum from the BBC World Service. I'm Rajan Datar, and joining me to discuss Yiddish language and culture is Aaron Lansky from the Yiddish Book Centre in Massachusetts in the United States, the Russian Jewish composer and international performer Polina Skovoroda Shepherd, and Dr Lily Kahn, the author of Colloquial Yiddish. And by the way, if you'd like to listen again to this programme or hear about other topics on history, science or literature, you can download past editions of The Forum as a free podcast. Just search for BBC The Forum. Now, we've been hearing how Yiddish, the language of the European Jews, led to the development of a rich culture of literature and music. But then the Holocaust and the founding of the modern state of Israel, where the speaking of Yiddish was discouraged, severely depleted the number of speakers. Now, Lily, give me a sense of how Yiddish then slowly started to recover in the late 20th century.
There were a few different factors, I'd say. One of them is, as you mentioned, the growth of Hasidic communities, which generally remained Yiddish-speaking after the Holocaust, but often were kind of built up again from the ashes. And then another one is renewed interest in Yiddish among descendants of Yiddish speakers who hadn't been exposed to the language or had only heard it but, had never learned to speak it. So that kind of contributed to a rise in university programs teaching Yiddish and Yiddish summer schools. And both of those trends have continued, really.
And in fact, going back to the 20th century, what we can also say is that Yiddish may not have been spoken much, but it had a legacy. And for example, many American comedians, Aaron, came from a Yiddish background, like Danny Kaye, who I know, and Jackie Mason. And then there were, and still are, all those Yiddish words taken into English. Aaron, why are there so many Yiddish speakers in the US? And give me some sense of their cultural influence.
It is the glory of America that every ethnic group that comes here brings its own culture with them. And the country becomes kind of an amalgam of all of these, and it gives it great energy, of course. But Yiddish certainly brought its own perspective, and because that perspective was rooted in an outsider population of people who had been on the outs for a very long time, it was the in-language of a people on the outs, if you will. It ended up bringing a particular point of view, which I think became irresistible. So it infused American comedy for a very long time, for example. But what's happening now is a little different from that, because it's one thing to kind of pick a Yiddish word here or there and everybody laughs because somehow it sounds funny. That was kind of a tangential connection with the culture. What's happening now is something a good deal more profound, which is a phenomenon of younger people in particular beginning to learn the language and explore the vast literature that it produced.
Well, in a sense, you are responsible, Aaron, for some of this. And I want to get into your story, because why did you feel you needed to take active steps way back in, I think it was the 70s, to preserve the culture?
Well, I went to college in 1973 at Hampshire College in Massachusetts. And early on, I had taken a course on the Holocaust, which, unbeknownst to me at the time, it was the first time the Holocaust had ever been taught as a college course in the United States. It was a subject most people had tried to shy away from for a long time. And I found the whole thing fascinating, but by the end of the semester, I was much less interested in kind of the mechanics of how the Nazis had pursued the murder of the Jewish people of Europe, and far more interested in who were these Jews and what was it about them that was so kind of antithetical to fascist ideology that caused this maniacal focus on their destruction. So I started studying Jewish history, and eventually I started studying German and Hebrew, and then started studying Yiddish, because I realized that something like 80% of the world's Jews had spoken the language, and if I was going to understand them, I obviously needed to understand the language they had actually spoken. Once I immersed myself in learning Yiddish, though, I then came upon this very major problem, and that was that almost everything that had been published in Yiddish, and it was vast, something like 40,000 titles had come out in the modern period in Yiddish, almost all of it was out of print. By the time I got to graduate school in Montreal in 1977, the joke was that if you wanted to find a particular Yiddish book, you could either find it at a rare book dealer in Amsterdam, or perhaps you could find it in a garbage can in Brooklyn, and there wasn't too much in between. So it was at that point that I said, someone's got to do something about this. And I took what I thought was going to be a 2-year leave of absence from graduate school. I met with scholars who estimated that 70,000 Yiddish volumes were still extant and recoverable. I set out to save them, and 40 years later, we've collected well over 1.5 million volumes and are still going strong.
And how did you manage to build up this collection of Yiddish books? I mean, who gave them to you, and any particular ones that stand out?
Sure. I mean, for many, many years, it was really we called it kitchen table book collecting. I would go out in an old ratty, rental van, and we'd bounce down the highway and often to New York City, but other cities around North America. And we would go to the homes of older Jews who would summon us. And they would sit us down at their kitchen table, and they would serve us a hot tea in a glass, and they would bring a Luxchen Kugel, a kind of noodle pudding, out from the oven. And then they would get down to business, and they would always want to speak with us in Yiddish to make sure we were worthy of receiving their books. And then they would say to us invariably, they'd say, Junger Mann. Junger Mann means young man. It became kind of my generic name in the Yiddish world at that point. They would say, Junger Mann, Ot is unser Yerusha. Here is our inheritance. This is the greatest treasure that we have to leave to the world. It's not stocks and bonds. It's not a Mercedes-Benz. It's not a big house. It's these Yiddish books that they had collected over the course of their lifetime. And generally, their kids wouldn't have been interested. The grandchildren probably didn't even know what the language was. And so we were in our early 20s at this point, but they had no choice but to kind of trust us and give this to us, hoping that somehow we would do right by these books and find new readers for them.
So they had strong emotional significance for the people who gave them to you.
Yes.
And the breadth of where you've got them from, how far afield have they come from?
They've come from pretty much everywhere at this point. A very large shipment just arrived from South Africa, for example, just a few days ago.
I'm interested in the kind of books that you've got in your collection. I mean,
that's a great question. The range is kind of astonishing. So I've had reporters come into the book center and they stand on a balcony level and you can look out over all these stacks of Yiddish books and they say, tell me about these ancient volumes. But of course, there's nothing ancient about them, neither in age nor in content. It's an emphatically modern literature in every sense of the word. Modern to the point of avant-garde, it's expressionism and impressionism and surrealism and eroticism. All of this can be found in the pages of Yiddish books. To answer your question a little more exactly, I would say about half of the books are fiction of some sort and about half are nonfiction.
And female authors as much as male?
As much, no, but a tremendous representation of women writers. And the only problem, of course, is that, as often happens, the women writers were often overlooked, and it's only now that they're being kind of rediscovered and brought back into the word. You want me to give you one example that's really would kind of tell you the whole story?
Yes, please.
We're training a whole new generation of Yiddish translators now. Only 2% of the literature has been translated. So 2 of our translators teamed up to translate the work by a woman writer named Bluma Lempel. I had gone to graduate school in Yiddish literature. I never heard the name of Bluma Lempel. But in fact, she had come from Europe, lived in Paris, eventually ended up in the United States, lived out on Long Island in a suburban neighborhood. And into her 90s, she continued to write in Yiddish and wrote stories of a sort that Yiddish literature had never seen before, about the sexuality of middle-aged women, about issues like abortion, about Zen Buddhism. I mean, these were really contemporary concerns. She wrote into her 90s in the 1990s. Eventually, these were published. But the fact that it took till now for her to be translated and brought out to the world suggests both the prejudice prevailing back then, but also suggests the extraordinary hunger for this kind of literature today and the receptivity to it.
Now, Polina, like Aaron, you're also seeking to regenerate Yiddish culture, but through music, writing new songs that still remain within the Yiddish tradition. And I know for you, what's happened to you is incredible. In the 1990s, you became the principal Yiddish choir leader of the former Soviet Union, and your Yiddish band was even chosen to perform in front of Boris Yeltsin.
Yeah, that was that. That was that.
Yeah. And you're also the director of 2 Yiddish choirs in Brighton and in London. Mm-hmm. Tell me this, how do you choose the repertoire for them?
Oh, many things. We don't only sing Yiddish folklore, we sing new compositions. We sing, for example, a Catalan freedom song translated into Yiddish. We sing Der Katerinchik, which is a Schubert in Yiddish, which was also traditional. All these songs were translated into Yiddish, and 100 years ago they would have been sung. There was a Schubert, a serenade in Yiddish, and all these operas translated into Yiddish. So it's quite traditional to do all that.
But regenerating the Yiddish culture is one thing, but reviving the Yiddish language is a much bigger challenge. And Lily, you're the author of a book called Colloquial Yiddish. Can you give me some examples of how Yiddish language has arrived in the 21st century?
I guess there are 2 different ways that Yiddish has developed. There's the Hasidic variety of Yiddish and then other varieties of Yiddish that are, spoken by people who are kind of usually less religious. So in what's called the secular Yiddish world, which basically just kind of means not ultra-Orthodox, there have been a lot of new words created to describe 21st century technology. And often because the Yiddish world is quite interconnected, even though it's small in terms of numbers and very dispersed geographically, I think the internet has helped, and often people will meet each other and new words will spread. So sometimes a word might be published in the Vorwärts, which is a Yiddish newspaper that used to be a daily and now is online.
So throw me some examples.
So for example, there are a couple of different words for mobile phone. There's Zelke, and there's Keshephone, and there's Mobilke. So Yiddish is, kind of very well stocked if you want to talk with words for talking about mobile phones. And then, I don't know, like a microwave, which is not so new anymore, but a microwave is a mikrochwalnik. And, anything else that you want to talk about, you can talk about in Yiddish in terms of modern technological innovations. In the Hasidic world, there is a lot more use of loanwords, I would say. So this is also something that's traditional, that's always existed in Yiddish, is borrowing from the surrounding languages. So that's how Yiddish got its Slavic component, is, people just picking up words from the surrounding languages. And then the same happens now with Yiddish-speaking people in London, say, they might borrow a word from English.
So, for example,
like mobile or phone or that sort of thing. And then in Israel, there's also a big Hasidic Yiddish-speaking community, and they much more commonly borrow words from modern Hebrew.
And if you had to estimate very quickly how many Yiddish speakers you think there are right now in the world, what would you say? What figure would you give me?
I guess maybe around 1 million. You see estimates ranging from 500,000 to 2 million, so it's obviously not an exact science. And part of that is, or a large part of that is just because the Yiddish-speaking world is so dispersed throughout the world, and there aren't any kind of really good official census figures.
And Polina, do you really think that a language like this can be revived? No.
No, I think it can stay as part of this big world culture. Well, I'm not a specialist to talk about language and how languages develop, but I see how music is developing, and I see that klezmer music and Yiddish music has become part of general world music language already. A lot of, say, brass bands, Balkan bands include klezmer music into their repertoire, and this is happening now in classical music. We have klezmer and Yiddish quotes and all that, and I think that in that sense, Yiddish is already part of global musical and cultural
so the language and music is how it will carry on.
I think so, yeah.
And Aaron, I know you had millions of downloads on your website. Tell me why you think there's such an interest now in Yiddish.
I think two things have happened. One was an academic transformation. As there was a greater emphasis on social cultural history, it became necessary to turn more to Yiddish sources in order to understand people in their own language. But then something more began to happen, and that is that the world's just become so much more infinitely multicultural than it once was. Certainly here in the United States, with obvious exceptions, we've learned to celebrate our diversity in America. And as that happens, it's not necessary any longer for Jews to make believe that their Jewishness is only a matter of religion and to kind of be embarrassed about the rest of it or kind of try to keep the rest of it at arm's length. Now, for younger people like my own daughters who are in their 20s, when they sit down with kids from all over the world and they start talking, they want to bring their own stake to the table. They want to understand who they are and where their family comes from and what their worldview was all about. And so for that reason, I think it's a terrific moment that we have right now to begin reclaiming the totality of Jewish culture. And Yiddish certainly was very much part of that. Whether it will be revived as a spoken language is impossible to say. I think that it came to birth in communities that were self-contained in a way that many Jewish communities no longer are. So I think it certainly will continue in the Hasidic world, but whether it can exist outside of that, I think we got to just wait and see. I mean, nobody thought Hebrew would be revived either, and it did pretty well. So that remains an open question.
And just finally, is Yiddish, do you think, Lily, a language and culture only for Jewish people?
No, definitely not. So traditionally, obviously, Yiddish is very much a Jewish language, and it's just completely packed with Jewish cultural references and Jewish textual references. But there's a long history of coexistence between Jews and other peoples in Eastern Europe, and a lot of evidence of non-Jewish speakers of Yiddish, kind of already in the pre-modern period. And then now, I think definitely in the, kind of so-called secular world of Yiddish, it's extremely diverse, and we get all kinds of people from all kinds of different backgrounds and nationalities coming to study Yiddish on summer courses for all kinds of different reasons. And, sometimes people who had never had any previous experience of Jewish culture go on to become Yiddish teachers themselves. So it's very, very open, and there's room for everyone.
And I think what's also interesting is that there's a connection, isn't there, with kind of anarchic and communist movements with Yiddish, which has united people from outside Yiddish nationality. Is that right?
Yes, definitely. So I think there's a long tradition within Yiddish of being welcoming to everybody and, being sort of very non-sectarian, and there's room for all kinds of different grassroots political views, and this sort of very long and proud history of anarchism and communism, which is interesting because that kind of sits alongside the very, very traditional Hasidic and ultra-Orthodox worldview, which is also part of Yiddish. So it's a really nice mix of everything.
Well, many thanks to all three of you, Lily Kahn, Aaron Lansky and Polina Skovoroda Shepherd. I actually want to say goodbye in Yiddish. Tell me how I say that.
If it's to one person, sei gesund, which literally means be healthy. And if it's to more than one person, seid gesund.
Seid gesund. Because hopefully we're speaking to more than one person. And I think, actually, Polina, would you sing us out with a Yiddish song to say goodbye?
Yes, I want to sing a song about holding our goblets with wine higher and drinking to love and friendship between different peoples and singing until we become one beautiful melody together. Haberim, hebt Hecher, die Bechers mit Wein, soll leben die Liebschaft gesund, soll sie sein. Die Liebschaft von Joche zum Joche, dem Mensch, die Freundschaft von Völker soll sein uns gebencht. Wir seien alle Otto auf der Erd, was hat uns a Liebschaft a größe Bagger, was planscht den Herz wie verborgene Schein, bis Gesicht in ewigen Nigen